The British Isles have had a dynamic and complicated history to say the least. Being islands, their tendency to be invaded and besieged by different ethnic groups from continental Europe has largely shaped its trajectory. In this series of videos, I will be focusing solely on the Kingdom of England and its successor states, Great Britain, United Kingdom, etc., and the monarchy that defined them, as I believe this will be the best way to incorporate the other kingdoms of the British Isles, as they will all eventually be absorbed into English rule in some way or another. It is possible that later I will investigate Scotland, Wales, and Ireland and their complex political systems later, but for now I'll be focusing on the largest of the four constituent countries of the modern United Kingdom. Before jumping straight into the foundation of what can only be called England itself, I must give some background on the British Isles as a whole. Of the more than 6,000 individual islands, the two main islands of the British Isles are Ireland and Great Britain. Around the 4th or 5th century BC, members of the Celtic language family arrived on the British Isles, fully settling both these large islands. By the end of the 1st century AD, these so-called insular Celts had established several distinct tribes, which could be divided into two linguistic subgroups, Goodelic and Brittonic. Simply enough, the Goodelics were the people of Ireland, while the Brittonics, or British, occupied Great Britain. However, the northern part of the Great Britain, modern-day Scotland, contained a particular group of people known as the Picts. Linguists for decades have argued about the relation of the Picts to any other Indo-European language group, and most believe that they were a linguistic isolate, much like the Basques. However, recent studies have placed them within the Brittonic subgroup, but we will separate them from the British Celts of modern-day England and Wales for simplicity's sake. In 55 BC, Roman general Julius Caesar, right in the middle of his campaign against the Gaulish Celts of France, invaded Great Britain. He believed that the Britons were assisting the Gauls against the invading Roman forces. This invasion proved to be unsuccessful, but it did turn out to be a moral victory, as the Senate back in Rome rejoiced in Caesar's ability to infiltrate the remote island that was mostly unknown to Roman society. Once Rome became an empire under Augustus in 27 BC, there were plans to invade the island again, but this never came to fruition. Instead, Rome pursued a policy of favoring one British tribal kingdom over the other in an attempt to weaken the overall order of the society. Finally, in 43 AD, Emperor Claudius launched an invasion of his own, and slowly but surely conquered almost all of modern-day England and Wales. There were several revolts from the humiliated Celtic tribes, most notably by Boudica of the Iceni tribe, but these were all crushed. Britannia became a new province in the increasingly powerful Roman Empire, and this was Rome's most northern territory in its entire history. An attempt was made to conquer the Pictish kingdom to the north during the reign of Hadrian in the early 2nd century, but no headway was made, and the famous Hadrian's Wall was forced to be constructed in modern-day Northumberland, England, to keep out the ever-invading Picts. The Romans never seemed to be that interested in invading Ireland, or Ibernia as they called it, leaving the Goodelic Celts, or Gaelic peoples, to their own devices. The subjected British people slowly became Romanized, and even certain dialects of Vulgar Latin began to spread all over the new province. The Romans introduced important advances to Great Britain, such as an entire system of roads, aqueducts, and baths. They settled several cities that still exist today, such as Glogum, Gloucester, Isca, Exeter, Eboracum, York, Lindum, Lincoln, and Londinium, London. A pivotal moment in Roman history was the adoption of Christianity as the new official state religion in 383 AD, replacing the polytheism that had shaped Roman society for centuries. This decision helped spread Christianity throughout the remaining parts of the empire that had yet to be Christianized, and Britannia was no exception. The British developed a special form of Christianity that eventually became Celtic Christianity, which differed from the eventual standardized Roman Church in superficial aspects such as when Easter fell and monk hair length. Pagan Ireland was eventually Christianized in the 5th century by a Welsh slave named St. Patrick. However, this was not the end of paganism in the British Isles, not by a long shot. Around 406, the Roman province of Gaul, modern-day France, was being invaded by several Germanic tribes, which forced Emperor Constantine III to withdraw most of, if not all, the troops that kept order in Britannia from the British Isles to fight on the continent. The western half of the Roman Empire was in decline, both financially and militarily, and Britain was simply abandoned to protect the more important provinces from the constantly invading Germanic armies. This in turn left post-Roman Britannia ripe for those same forces to take it over. While the Franks and Goths decimated western and southern Europe, lesser-known Germanic tribes from the Jutland Peninsula would be the ones to invade Great Britain. These were the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons, all closely related within the Western Germanic language subgroup. Saxons that remained in modern-day Germany gave rise to the Low German dialect. These three tribes migrated to the east coast of Great Britain in 442 and began to move west into the rest of what was left of Roman Britannia towards the end of the 5th century. They were able to push the native British into modern-day Cumbria to the north, Wales in the central, and Cornwall to the south, effectively replacing the British Celtic and Latin languages they adopted from the Romans with the new amalgamation of Germanic dialects that would eventually lead to English. The forcing of the British into the western fringes of their home island by these pagan raiders caused many to flee across the English Channel, notably from Cornwall to modern-day Brittany in northwest France and modern-day Galicia in northwest Spain, giving rise to the Bretons and Bretonians, respectively. The British that remained would be subjected to several Anglo-Saxon attempts at a total conquest of former Britannia, and had to continually fight to preserve their Christianity and Celtic heritage. Meanwhile, by the 7th century, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had developed into a more permanent, orderly patchwork of kingdoms in their part of Great Britain. The Angles had largely settled in the north and central part of the new Germanic sphere of influence, forming the kingdoms of Northumbria to the far north, Mercia in the central west, and East Anglia in the easternmost peninsula. The Saxons settled largely in the far south, forming the kingdoms of Wessex in the southwest, Sussex in the very south, and Essex in the southeast. The most southeastern part of Great Britain, in addition to the Isle of Wight, were settled by the Jutes, forming the Kingdom of Kent. These 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were known by later historians as the Heptarchy, or Rule of 7. Throughout this political situation, there would almost always seem to be a high king of sorts that claimed overlordship of the other 6 kingdoms. Kent and East Anglia were the most powerful kingdoms early on in the 7th century, while Northumbria and Mercia became more powerful later in that century. The 7 kingdoms all had a more or less similar culture and increasingly common tongue, all worshipping several pagan gods that were West Germanic versions of the well-known Norse gods such as Odin and Thor, or Woden and Thunor as they were known in Anglo-Saxon. However, with the help of an increasing amount of missionaries from the displaced Britons and from Rome, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were slowly converted to Christianity throughout the latter half of the 7th century, starting with the baptism of the kings themselves, which didn't necessarily mean the full conversion of the whole populace. Sussex and the Isle of Wight were the last 2 holdouts until they were Christianized in the 680s. After much debate about whether these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would adhere to the Celtic Church or the Roman Church, it was finally decided that the English Church, which was shared by all 7 kingdoms, would follow the Roman way. Anglo-Saxon society continued to persist in a very similar political situation for most of the 8th century, until it became shattered by a crisis that was affecting the rest of Europe. Raiders and plunderers from the pagan North Germanic kingdoms of Denmark and Norway were ravaging the entire continent and beyond, from Greenland to the north, North America to the west, North Africa to the south, and modern-day Russia to the east. Early on, most of this was simple pillaging, but by the 9th century, permanent Viking settlements were forming in southern Italy, Ireland, northern France, and eventually England. Most of the Viking incursions into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were from Denmark, and they mostly targeted monasteries, which were where most of the wealth was located. The so-called Great Heathen Army, endorsed by the King of Denmark with the help of Norwegian and Swedish mercenaries, invaded England in 865 with the goal of taking over as much territory as they could. To the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons were just another remote realm to be added to their growing maritime empire. This was a successful pursuit, as Northumbria would fall in 867, East Anglia in 869, and Mercia in the mid-870s. Kent and Essex would also fall by the late 870s, leaving Wessex as the only remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The king of Wessex at the time was Alfred, who had begun his reign in 871 upon the death of his elder brother Ethelred. He was married to Ealhswith, a daughter of a Mercian nobleman, so he had a great interest in recovering that kingdom from the Viking invaders, especially with them pressing into Wessex from the north. In 878, Alfred and his men defeated an invading Norse army at the Battle of Edington in modern-day Wiltshire, which was a turning point for Anglo-Saxon hopes. Alfred was then able to pursue the Danes into their own territory of Mercia, eventually forcing their leader Guthrum to surrender to Alfred, wherein he was baptized and converted to Christianity. In the peace negotiations, the Danes were to surrender the western half of Mercia to Wessex, while the eastern half would remain part of the then so-called Danelaw. In the 880s, Alfred was able to recapture Kent, Sussex, and Essex from the Danes and incorporate them into Wessex, thus pacifying London and making it habitable to Anglo-Saxon society again. Alfred, commonly known with this epithet the Great, had now single-handedly won back at least half of the territory the Danes had taken from the Anglo-Saxons, and had united them under one king, a king from perhaps one of the least remarkable of the 7 previous kingdoms. Alfred officially began styling himself as King of the Anglo-Saxons in 886. The Danes still controlled what was once part of the kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, but the situation for the Christian Anglo-Saxons were looking far better than it had decades previously. Subjects of the Danelaw, particularly in Northumbria, were heavily influenced by Scandinavian culture, and this gave way to the adoption of several Norse words into the English lexicon. Words like ransack, slaughter, berserk, husband, and rotten are among these. Meanwhile, Alfred the Great was restoring education, art, and religious life in his own territory. Alfred and his wife Ealhswith had 4 daughters and 1 son, Edward, born in 874. Edward was known as an Aetheling, which is the Anglo-Saxon word for prince of the royal house, as he was the heir apparent. Edward married a noblewoman named Egwin in the early 890s and produced a son, Ethelstan, around 894. King Alfred apparently gave a ceremony for his new grandson and seemed to favor him much more than his own son, who was proving to sway a lot more fame as a young warrior than the aging man that had once restored Anglo-Saxon glory. Alfred the Great died in 899 at age 52, and Edward promptly ascended to the throne of Wessex, and therefore Anglo-Saxon throne, at age 25. However, this succession was not without controversy. As mentioned before, Edward's father Alfred had ascended to the Wessex throne in 871 at the death of elder brother Ethelred. Ethelred had 2 young sons, Ethelhelm and Ethelwold, but the Viking crisis at the time prompted the Wessex nobles to elect the more seasoned younger brother Alfred, thus passing over the senior line of succession. Naturally, Ethelwold, who was alive in 899, challenged his cousin Edward's claim, as he was part of the junior line, arguing that once his uncle Alfred died, the throne would revert back to the senior Ethelred line. Edward was officially crowned king in the summer of 900, while Ethelwold gathered support from the Danes, using the old adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." He convinced the Danes of East Anglia to invade English Mercia, which they did, only for them to be destroyed by England's forces at the Battle of Holm in 902. Ethelwold himself died in battle. Edward's throne was secure, but he had new aspirations to take back more territory for the Danes and incorporate it into his kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. Sometime in the early 900s, his wife Egwin died, prompting him to marry another noblewoman, Ealhfled. Their marriage brought forth the birth of 2 significant children, daughters Eadgifu and Eadgith, around 902 and 910 respectively. Eadgifu would go on to marry Charles III, King of West Francia, in 918, and Ealda would have a brief marriage to Hugh Capet, the ancestor of all ensuing French monarchs. In the late 910s, Edward successfully conquered southern Mercia and East Anglia from the Danelaw, only leaving Northumbria in the hands of the Danes. The kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons had once again grown, and it was only a matter of time before it would reach its zenith and finally drive out all the remaining Norse pagans. By the end of the 910s, Edward's second wife Ealhfled had died, so he married a third time to yet another Anglo-Saxon noblewoman, Eadgifu of Kent. Their marriage produced 2 sons, Edmund in 939 and Edred in 946. After a successful reign which was based around the reconquest of several Anglo-Saxon territories from the Danes, continuing the legacy of his father, Edward died in 924. Ethelstan, Edward's eldest son by his first wife, was now 35 years old and was crowned in 925 on the border between Wessex and Mercia, 2 realms that were still trying to get used to being united under one monarch. There was some early opposition to Ethelstan's rule, with some supporting the claims of Edward's younger sons with his later marriage, but by the 930s Ethelstan had secured his position as Edward's successor. One of the first notable events in Ethelstan's reign was his taking advantage of the death of Danish ruler of Northumbria in 927, invading York and effectively recapturing all previous Anglo-Saxon territory from the Viking invaders. He officially declared himself King of the English from this point on, making him arguably the first King of England, as he was the first single Anglo-Saxon to control most of the territory that comprises the modern country. Ethelstan's conquest of Northumbria was met by opposition by its citizens, who felt more aligned with Scandinavia and didn't want any southern king presiding over their affairs. Despite this, he remarkably was able to get the neighboring Celtic kingdoms of Strathclyde and Scotland to submit to him and acknowledge him as King of all English, something his grandfather had done with the western Celtic kingdoms of Gwynedd, Powys, Deheubarth, and Gwent in modern-day Wales. King Ethelstan was able to completely conquer the southwestern kingdom of Damonia and modern Cornwall. He was now the dominant monarch of the entire island of Great Britain, and prospects were looking great for his new nation, which can now confidently be called England. Ethelstan developed and codified the Anglo-Saxon law, which is still in effect of many Western countries today, and maintained close relations with the church and the bishops that comprised it. As mentioned before, his half-sisters were both married to continental rulers, so England was now connected to the developing European landscape. The one problem with Ethelstan's reign was he never married. Because of this, he had no legitimate children, so his younger half-brothers Edmund and Edred were next in line to the throne. Ethelstan died in 939 at about the age of 45, and Edmund did indeed descend to the throne. Ethelstan's half-brother Edmund was only 18 years old at the time, and the Danish who had been expelled from England smelled blood in the water. The city of Dublin on the east coast of Ireland was a Viking colony, and the ruler of said city, Olaf Guthfrithson, invaded Northumbria and the Midlands, successfully capturing both, which placed England in a state of chaos yet again. Edmund quickly was able to recapture the Midlands, but had to acknowledge the new Danish kingdom centered around York, particularly with its populace not approving of Wessex rule. He was married to Elfgifu, a noblewoman from Shrewsbury, and they had two sons in the early 940s, Eadwig and Edgar. He was able to take back Northumbria in 943, and he also conquered the Celtic kingdom of Strathclyde, who was allied with the Danes, but ceded it to King Malcolm I of Scotland in exchange for peace. This helped secure England's northern border following the chaos. So after some adversity, Edmund was able to reestablish what his half-brother Ithelstan had generated. However, it wasn't for much longer. In 946, a thief murdered Edmund while he was attending a mass. Because Edmund's sons were less than 5 years old, Edmund's younger brother Edred was to take over the kingdom, consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury almost immediately, receiving the support of his earls and the Welsh kings. 23-year-old Edred inherited the issue of Northumbria from his brother, as the populace there still appealed to Scandinavians to liberate them from the House of Wessex. Edred was successful at bringing the earldom nominally under his control, but in the late 940s, one Eric Bloodaxe, a deposed king in Norway, attempted to invade Northumbria and claim it as his own kingdom. The local Northumbrians welcomed this, which angered Edred. He laid siege to the countryside of the north. Eventually, the destruction was so bad that the citizens decided to appease the Wessex king and deserted their allegiance to Eric Bloodaxe in 954. This was the only notable event of Edric's reign, as he became ill in 955 and died shortly thereafter, leaving no children. The succession was clear. The line would revert back to his elder brother Edmund, as his eldest son Edward was sufficiently aged enough to rule. Edward was in his mid-teens when he took over the throne of the English. Not a great age to start ruling, and his immaturity showed early on. After his coronation ceremony, he was seen dancing with a married noblewoman and her daughter in a provocative manner by Dunstan, abbot of Glastonbury. The abbot dragged him back to the coronation banquet, which angered the new king and the noblewoman greatly. Dunstan was then exiled and stripped of his titles. He married Elgifu, a descendant of Ethelred, king of Wessex, Alfred the Great's elder brother. Distant cousin marriage in a royal setting was not uncommon, but the church was so angry with the way Edred treated one of their abbots that they annulled the marriage against Edwig's will on the grounds of consanguinity. The Archbishop of Canterbury was behind this, and also supported a rebellion in East Anglia revolving around Edwig's younger brother Edgar. Many of the leading nobles of England thought it would be best to divide England into two realms, with Edwig ruling in the south and Edgar in the north. This did not come into fruition, as Edwig solved his own problems by dying in 959, probably before his 20th birthday. Young Edgar would succeed him. Edgar ascended to the English throne at age 16, and he immediately recalled the exiled Abbot Dunstan and made him the Archbishop of Canterbury. He pacified the country that was rocked by a near-civil war during the reign of his elder brother Edwig. He standardized measurement throughout England, and with the help of Dunstan introduced the Benedictine reform to the monasteries, which required monks not to be able to marry, among other important changes to church functions, which would have lasting effects later on. Edgar's reign was remarkably peaceful, with little to no challenges from the constant Scandinavian threat, and he was able to fully integrate the disparate parts of Anglo-Saxon society into one kingdom, perhaps for the first time ever. In 962, he sired an illegitimate son named Edward before marrying Illthrift of Devon. This union produced a legitimate son, Ethelred, in 966. In 973, 14 years after his ascension to the throne, Archbishop Dunstan performed the official coronation for Edgar, which set the precedence for all English coronations to come, as it would occur as a culmination of the reign of a king and not the initiation thereof. After a quite successful and stable reign, Edgar died in the summer of 975 at the young age of 32, leaving behind his two sons from different mothers. Edgar's eldest son Edward was 13, while Ethelred was only 9. Edward seemed to be the more capable ruler due to his age, but the issue was, nobody knew who Edward's mother was. He definitely wasn't the son of Queen Ylfrith. One source stated that Edward was the son of a nun that Edgar seduced. Others stated that Edward was the son of a noblewoman from East Anglia, who Edgar had actually married before ascending to the throne, thus making Edward legitimate. Bishop Ethelwold of Winchester supported the former idea, while Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, supported the latter, thus creating a division within the English Church. To make matters worse, these bishops had supported the Benedictine reforms enacted by King Edgar, and the dispossessed nobles who had to make room for the land required for these reforms now were able to shake their fists in fury now that the old king was gone. Dunstan quickly had Edward anointed as king, much to the fury of Bishop Ethelwold and young Ethelred's mother, the Queen Dowager Ealhthryth. The new King Edward's reign was chaotic at best, with anti-monastic revolts occurring along with famines. Those who supported the new monasteries and those who were displaced by them often fought each other, thus leading to the breakdown of royal authority in the Midlands and the North. Probably the most notable aspect of Edward's unstable reign was his assassination in 978 at the age of 16, after only 3 years of reigning. Nobody knows for sure who the culprit was, but most theories provided by scholars at the time believed that Queen Dowager Ealhthryth ordered it on behalf of her disinherited son Ethelred. Edward was later remembered as a martyr, and a cult formed behind his memory, particularly from those that supported the Benedictine reforms. His younger brother Ethelred succeeded him. I've decided to split this video up into 2 parts. I think that this is a good place to end as Ethelred's reign, which is the next king, kind of begins kind of a different era of the House of Wessex, if you will. So I'm going to make this part 1, and then we'll pick up with part 2. Thank you.